Hi, everyone, and welcome to our Latinos and Climate Change live stream. My name is Adriana Arellano, Manager for Climate Initiatives at NextGen America, and I'll be your host this afternoon. In honor of Hispanic Heritage Month and NYC Climate Week, today we will discuss how and why climate change affects marginalized communities the most, specifically Latinos. And as you can see here, we have a wonderful panel of badass Latinos for you today, who are all experts from across the youth voting and climate movement space in the US. First and foremost, we have Cristina Cinsun Ramirez, who is the president of NextGen America. She spent the last 20 years founding and leading organizations, including Workers Defense Project, a Texas workers' rights organization, and JOLT, a Texas-based Latino rights organization. Cristina is an author on issues of race, gender, immigration, and was a 2020 US Senate candidate. She also teaches at the LBJ School of Public Policy at UT Austin. Ana Ramon is the executive director of Annie's List and Annie's List Training and Engagement Fund. A native of San Antonio and proud Texan, two Texans here, Ana has worked across political campaigns, the Texas legislature, and nonprofit spaces for over a decade. She's passionate about building women's political power and equipping the next generation of leaders with the tools they need to run for office and win. Natalie Montesino serves as a deputy executive director for the Climate Democracy Initiative, a nonprofit organization based in Colorado that supports democratically informed climate solutions. Through her development of education, media, and community organizing programs and partnerships, she seeks to apply critical climate and democracy lenses to all aspects of her work. Jasmine Moreno Dominguez is the climate justice coordinator at Poder Latinx. Jasmine is a dedicated and passionate individual, deeply interested in immigrant and economic justice. As an environmental community organizer, she focuses her work on advocacy and education within the Latinx community. Her work involves raising awareness about environmental justice issues such as equity, air quality, and health disparities resulting from environmental factors. She also strives to bridge the gap between federal and state policies to a largely Spanish-speaking community, ensuring that legislation and policies are accessible and relevant to those she serves. And lastly, we have Jessica Stiles, who is the Deputy Press Secretary of Voters of Tomorrow, a Gen Z-led organization that engages young Americans in politics and government. Growing up in Florida, she had a front row seat to the book bans, abortion clinic closures, rising sea levels, and anti-immigration rhetoric, and got involved because she wanted a better future for her loved ones. Jess worked as a journalist, educator, and organizer before combining her interests to use political communications to empower young people. Our panel, everyone. Grace, moving on to our first discussion question. So during moments of crises, it is often the people at the bottom that are affected the most, and climate change is no different. As the climate becomes more unpredictable and extreme, it will be those people with limited power and opportunities who experience the negative effects of this disaster the most. Cristina, could you help us understand how climate change affects Latinos in the US?
Yeah, so first off, love being on a powerhouse panel with puras chingonas, all Latinas. Thanks, Adrian, for moderating. And wanted to discuss first, Ana and I are here in Texas, right? So when we talk about Latinos, of course, you could talk about climate refugees from Latin America and the global South that are going to be the first impacted and already are. But if you talk about Latinos here in the United States, the vast majority of Latinos live in the places that are on the front lines of where the climate crisis is already very dangerous and going to get worse. So over 1 in 2 Latinos live in the key places where it's going to get extremely hot, where we're going to see floods, hurricanes. Florida, Texas, the Southwest from Texas to California, Arizona, New Mexico, that represents 36 million Latinos in the United States. And of course, I didn't even count in Puerto Rico. So if you count in Puerto Rico, we are over half of us are on the front lines of the climate crisis. And we know that some of the cities that are determined the worst and least resilient to suffer through the climate crisis, Houston, one of the largest population centers for the Latino community, also happens to be the epicenter of the oil and gas industry. I always like to remind people, though, that even though Texas is the largest carbon emitter and 1 in 5 Latinos live in Texas and suffers from the consequences of dirty air, that we also no state could produce as much solar or wind energy as Texas. So we have to think about not just what we're up against, but what we can do about it. And the last thing I'll say as far as the Latino population is that we work in some of the most difficult and hot jobs. So I spent 10 years here in Texas organizing construction workers. I represented workers that died of heat exhaustion, that had to work 10, 12-hour days in 100-degree plus heat. And I'll never forget the quote from a father of a young man that died in Dallas who was just 25. And he said, they wouldn't give him a rest break, and it was so hot outside that his organs literally cooked inside and killed him. And so we know that construction, landscaping, farm workers, these are key jobs that Latinos fill in, especially in these regions, the majority of the population. And I'll also mention that in Texas and Florida, the governors have outlawed basic things like rest breaks. I mean, you talk about cruelty, being inhumane towards the Latino population. And the way I think we organize and fight back against those kinds of cruel working conditions are, of course, having the labor movement and the climate justice movement join together and demand fair working conditions for people that have to work outside and face the consequences first of extreme heat, and whose work we all benefit from.
Yes, for sure. I think also something in addition to that is Latinos and Blacks are actually more likely to live in urban heat islands compared to whites. So even when the days are already hot, I mean, it's going to be 6 to 10 degrees hotter in our communities as well. And I think growing up, you're just like, oh, well, that's just the way it is. But, like our health is being negatively affected by a changing climate. So since we're on a Texas rollout, let's go with Ana Ramon.
No, thank you for allowing me to be here. And thank you, Christina, for all the amazing work you've done in Texas and across the country and highlighting what's happening in Texas. As someone who's worked in and around the political and legislative spaces for over 10 years, I can tell you a lot of this is happening because existing laws are written without communities like ours in mind. When we talk about institutionalized racism, when we talk about white supremacy, we're also talking about major weather events and the impacts that climate change has on our communities as Latinos. As you were talking about how this affects not only how we live and how we die in our state and then across the South, like Hispanics also, like we are 40% more likely to be impacted by a major weather event or to live through a major weather event. As you were just talking about Houston, I actually live in Houston now, and I've been through 2 major weather events. We had the derecho and Beryl, and unfortunately throughout that, I lost power, I lost water, and I also housed multiple families. And that was just my one singular experience, not to speak for the experience of an entire 3rd largest county in the country, right? So we're literally living and dying by the effects of extreme weather. And Hispanics and Latinos, as was mentioned, are 43% more likely to live in areas that are projected in work in the labor force and have impacts on their ability to do their jobs and even to literally live in their communities. And let's talk about transportation, right? So Hispanics and Latinos are actually 50% more likely to live in areas that are going to be impacted by coastal flooding and major weather events. So when you're talking about like what weather events take place, like as someone who drove around trees and power lines and couldn't even get into some communities, or people couldn't even get out of their homes because they're faced with this day-to-day reality of watching hurricanes, watching the weather, watching the spikes, like that is what's happening in our communities. And let's talk about air quality, right? Like there's something to be said about alerts that I get every day living in a cancer cluster, living in the cancer corridor, right? And even though we have this booming economy, it cannot be booming without the resiliency of Latinos. But I will say this, it is not fair to say that while we are resilient, we should not have to maintain resiliency. We deserve clean air, clean water, clean jobs, and a clean place to live. So enjoy. I'm excited to be here and share more about not only experience in Texas, but what we're seeing and across the country and be a part of this amazing panel. So thank you again.
Awesome. Yeah, I think when it comes to areas that are volatile to extreme weather, we're talking about Houston, San Antonio, Los Angeles, all the coastal communities in Florida which is where all the Latinos live in the country. So let's move on to Jasmine over at Arizona.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for having me here. I'm truly honored to be on a panel with such incredible Latino women. I wanted to start off with that. But yes, as you mentioned, I live in Arizona, and it is extremely, extremely hot here. And I want to give a shout out to Christina for mentioning construction workers. I am the proud daughter of a construction worker. My father has worked construction for the past 25 years here and has helped pave the roads in Arizona, and I'm extremely proud of that. But it goes without saying that the conditions that he suffers through, and a lot of his colleagues, which the majority are Latinos, as you mentioned, we tend to be overrepresented in these fields, suffer some extreme health consequences because of their working conditions. The entire conversation around extreme heat and climate change has been heavily focused on extreme heat here in Arizona, and I don't think sometimes other states can grasp just how hot it is. We know that land surface temperatures can get up to 160 degrees here, which is absolutely insane. And as you mentioned, Latinos are on the front line of a lot of the impacts of climate change. That goes without saying. And I want to give some brief statistics to also just put this into perspective. 40% of heat-related illnesses in Arizona are traced back to Latinos. At the same time, when we have temperatures of up to 120 degrees, 40% of Latinos do not have proper AC or AC at all. We know that Arizona has a very large population of Latinos, and the Hispanic community is undoubtedly here in Arizona. However, the conditions that we live and work in possess us and put us at a greater stance of suffering some of these effects from climate change. So I think that we hear these stories, but it's really important to talk to community members to really hear them out and really recognize and put faces to the faces of climate change, which more often than not are our community members. And then I also want to touch base on the issue of asthma here in our Latino communities. As an organizer, I'm often in these communities and talking to people and collecting stories. And I think asthma in the community goes often, as not as a highlight. But I want to mention that 18% of Latino youth in the Maryville community here in Arizona, which is a 98% Latino neighborhood, have asthma, which is double the national average in this country. So we unfortunately have environments that we live, work, and play in that put us at a greater risk of climate change. However, I want to end my section on a good note and say that we are also some of the most resilient. So thank you again for having me here.
Awesome. Yeah, I think one thing that people don't think about enough is that, due to redlining and other kind of historical things, Latinos, Blacks, and other marginalized communities are the ones who live next to these nuclear plants, these power plants, these like coal mining facilities, because, that's the only place where we could afford to live. And then as a direct result of that, we end up having long-term health complications just because, our parents couldn't afford to live anywhere else. So something really important to think about. So Natalie, I know you're in New York right now, but let us know what's going on and the work that you're doing over in Colorado.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, thank you again so much for having me. It's such a pleasure to be here today. And as you mentioned, I live and work in Colorado, and so I'd like to talk a little bit more about what some of our Colorado Latinos are facing first and foremost. And I'll start off by saying that I think when we're thinking about climate change now, there's this growing awareness that it's not just an environmental issue, but it's also a socioeconomic justice issue. And so my organization, the Climate Democracy Initiative, works nationally and internationally, but the bulk of our community work is taking place in Colorado, where we're headquartered and where I live. And so to highlight a couple of the issues and really echo the sentiments that we've already heard today, I first want to talk about how Latinos show up on the front lines of this global challenge. In Colorado, most of our Latino communities reside in areas that are the most vulnerable to climate-related disasters. So, for example, in the northern part of Denver, there are large groups of Latinos that are frequently affected by flooding. And then these are the communities who are also renters for the most part. So they don't have the resources to recover before the next disaster hits. And there's this vicious cycle that happens. And then on the flip side, our rural communities in places like the Eastern Plains and in South Central Colorado and the San Luis Valley, they're very, very vulnerable to severe drought and extreme heat, similar to what's going on in Arizona, but they don't have access to resilient housing. They don't have access to AC. And so this creates really poor health impacts for a lot of people. And speaking about health impacts, as was mentioned, asthma is a really big issue for a lot of our communities here in Colorado. 1 in 3 Latino children suffer from asthma, and they are at a greater risk to be hospitalized due to asthma complications compared to non-Latinos. And I think we can really expect to see these health impacts grow in severity as the climate crisis worsens. The final piece I'll touch on, though, is displacement due to climate change. We know that climate change can lead to forced migration, particularly for communities that are impacted by those extreme weather events and the loss of economic vitality due to those weather events. So in Colorado, as droughts and wildfires become more common, we're likely to see increased pressure on Latino populations who depend on agriculture, natural resources, for example. I'll point out the Arkansas River Valley as an example of that, where we're already seeing higher migration rates as families are seeking safety, they're seeking better opportunities elsewhere, which is straining, of course, both the sending and the receiving communities. And so I think to effectively address climate change, not only in Colorado, but the entire country, it requires recognizing the specific vulnerabilities of Latino communities and ensuring that they're deeply integrated into all of our climate action plans. We have to create and support policies that protect Latino communities who are at an increased risk compared to their non-Latino counterparts.
Yeah, of course. And I think when we talk about displacement, I mean, we're really talking about like the Southeast, and with Florida being like a really important state where there's just like so much volatility going on, but it can be argued that there's not enough preparation and kind of policies in place to respond to these disasters. So Jessica, maybe you can walk us through what's going down there in Florida and what we can do better to manage this crisis.
Yeah, I mean, wow, what a panel to have to follow. So much has already been said. But yeah, I am also a daughter of a construction worker in Florida. And growing up, most of the Latinos in my neighborhood were also families that worked in construction as well. So really seriously thinking about like what our front lines really look like and who's being impacted and what industries are being impacted is such an important piece of this conversation. And again, echoing the extreme weather, and in Florida specifically, some of the superstorms and the hurricanes that we see every single year just getting worse and worse. And I think an important piece of that again has already been beautifully brought up is, the housing resilience and the resilience of, the physical communities that we live in. I think, my dad working in construction, just anecdotally, one thing that he did throughout the last 30 years is hurricane cleanup. And something he noticed when he was traveling around the state was not unfortunately surprising how much marginalized and Latino communities were always the last ones to get their trash picked up, to get their, damaged homes that were suddenly growing mold because of flooding and posing all of these very serious health issues. They were always the last ones to receive help from the government, from the state, even from local entities. It seemed like, the urgency just wasn't there in those communities from outside forces. So I think talking about this, we have to make sure that we are taking a very intersectional approach, because climate change is impacting Latino communities super significantly, and it just is so far reaching. We have to include the housing conversations. We have to include access to healthcare in these conversations. We have to look at these small solutions and these, legislation that are going to take multiple years to pass. So it's really just such an intersectional issue that has so many elements to it. But that, I'll leave us kind of on a little optimistic note. That just means that there's so much that we can do, and there's so much that our communities are already doing, and real tangible ways that we can make a difference.
Yeah, of course. And I think the theme that I kind of got from everyone's responses is that I think, there's an understanding that climate change is affecting our communities, but Latinos need to be the one who take responsibility to do something about it, right? And it's just like there's so many things that can be done, but there's also so much opportunity that kind of is being brought to our table here, where it's like, there's a lot of investments coming in. There's a lot of job training. There's a lot of, things in the future that can be beneficial for us as long as we take the responsibility to make sure that we're gaining these opportunities. So I wanted to take a small pause here on what's going on now and think a little bit about the future. So although we are already starting to see more extreme and unpredictable weather, the most difficult aspect in solving the climate crisis is that the worst impact will be tomorrow's problem. Young people today and our kids will be the generation that will feel the most adverse impacts of a changing climate. Youth, thus, are an extremely important group in tackling and leading the problem of climate change. Maybe we can start out with Natalie this time. How can youth be more involved in the fight for a better environment and better future?
Yeah, this is a really great question. So as a young person actively engaged in climate work, I often find myself feeling pretty frustrated by the typical avenues of engagement that are presented to us. We're encouraged to participate in events and to use our voices. And while there's certainly a lot of enthusiasm about including young people as an important audience, the follow through on our ideas and contributions, in my view, often falls short. And so, as a young leader in an executive role at a nonprofit, I've encountered skepticism quite often about my authority and my expertise on varieties of issues simply because of my age. And so, this can be really disheartening. And I imagine it's probably true for a lot of young leaders out there. And I've certainly faced some imposter syndrome at various stages in my leadership journey. So, the advice that I would give to other young change makers, especially in the Latino community, is to continue striving for a seat at this table, and not just any seat, but a seat at the head of the table. Your perspectives and your experiences are incredibly valuable, and it's crucial for you to advocate for opportunities to influence decisions that shape our future. So I encourage you to seek out community projects that need leadership. You can look out for local boards and committees that are recruiting. And of course, engaging in networking to broaden your support base, because the more people who recognize your potential and want to invest in your leadership, the more influence you can wield in the climate movement. So just remember that you're never too young or too inexperienced to start making a difference, and every effort counts and your voice deserves to be heard.
For sure. And I mean, I think since this crisis will affect youth the most, I think it's only fair for them to have a seat, a leadership position at the negotiating table as well. So moving on to another young climate leader, Jasmine, talk to us about what type of things the youth can do to be better involved in this fight. I think you're muted.
Apologies. I want to start off by mentioning that I have met some of the most amazing individuals throughout this journey and throughout this career. And by far, the most inspirational and the loudest have been the youth. I have sat through roundtables, I have sat through events and public speaking opportunities. And sometimes behind the microphone is a 15-year-old high school student or a college student. And after those talks, I noticed that I am left the most inspired I have ever been. I can still consider myself quite young. However, I know that there are other individuals like my younger family members, my younger cousins, younger siblings, who are now restructuring the way that they are going to live their future lives, their family plans, their career plans, because of the impacts of climate change. But I do want to give them a quick shout out and say that I do believe that so many of them are already so incredibly involved in meeting with their representatives and volunteering and planting trees and participating in so many initiatives. And they are truly so brave and outspoken, and I want to commend them for all of their actions. However, for those that maybe have, are considering joining on these efforts or are curious and don't know where to start, I really do want to tell every young person out there that it can start just by simply looking up on Google environmental organizations near me. I can assure you that there is more than plenty. Look one up, find one that fits best for you, and check out what events they have going on. Participate in one of those, ask to volunteer, and they can mentor you and they can facilitate you in your journey to become an advocate. And then one of the most important things that I also want to highlight is meeting with your elected officials and your representatives. We know that the youth voice has so much power, truly, the youth perspective, in all sectors of our life, but specifically when we're talking about elected officials. So I want to urge everybody to meet with their elected officials and let your voice heard, because we can not only, you know, complain about these things going on, but we have to take initiative because this is our future and it relies in our hands. So I really, really want to, you know, push that out there, meet with your representatives, and of course, go out and vote.
Well, as a geriatric millennial myself, I know that like the most inspiration and kind of the most like surprise that I get is always coming from the youth. So I mean, I don't know if you guys know this, but in Montana there was a group of like kids, like 10 to like 12-year-old kids who sued the state of Montana and won, and forced the state to consider the effects of climate change when deciding on renewing fossil fuel projects. And I think that's just kind of like, you know, I don't think someone who's like worked in this for like 10 years would have thought like, oh man, like should we go like down the legal route, you know, to like challenge fossil fuel companies in their fight for the planet. And I think because the youth just kind of bring these like new and fresh ideas, it really forces the movement to go forward even faster. And I think that when it comes to youth, you can't talk about youth without talking about NextGen America, the nation's largest youthful organization. So, Cristina, can you talk to us a little bit about how to get involved in the climate movement and what the youth can do to kind of better this fight?
Yeah, so I would first say, you know, just so people understand our history and how we came to this moment. So we were started over a decade ago with the premise and understanding that if we invested in the power of young people, we could tackle the biggest crisis of our time, which was the climate crisis. And we were going to build the political power of an army of voters that were going to advocate and organize and push elected officials to deliver on bold climate policy. And I'll tell you that over a decade ago, people laughed at that and said it was a total waste of money and time, that young people didn't turn out, that they were unreliable. And not just by our organization, but a movement of young people. You know, at NextGen, we've registered over 1.5 million young voters over that time period, organized and engaged millions more to turn them out. And it's over a decade later, and we have had the 3 highest youth voter turnouts in American history the last 3 elections, and the passage of the Inflation Reduction Act, the single largest investment by any country on the planet to tackle the climate crisis. And for me, that's just the beginning. And I think it really proves the political power of young people, which are the largest generational voting bloc in the United States. I say we've got to do 4 things. That what we have to understand is that young voters are clear, especially when we talk about young Latinos. A lot of people are surprised that are not in the Latino community to learn that Latinos are the ethnic group that is most concerned about the realities of the climate crisis and most willing to take action. But they're often not asked, right? I think people also think the climate movement is an elitist movement. No, it's a movement for everyone because this is our entire planet. And as we've discussed, we are on the front lines of the consequences of inaction on the climate crisis. But we have tremendous power, especially young people, you know, from young people filing lawsuits in Montana. And hopefully there's going to go all the way up to the Supreme Court to discuss the constitutional right to clean air, to clean water, and the failures of government to protect the next generation when it comes to the climate crisis. Or Sunrise, organizing and pushing both political parties. You know, there's just so much being done. But I think you don't have to have a climate career, and you can be a climate activist with whatever you do and wherever you are, because this is an issue that touches all of us. And so I think there's 4 things that we can always do. 1, baseline, if you are able to vote, you should be voting, and you should be voting for candidates that, 1, are smart enough to listen to scientists, and 99% of them say the climate crisis is real. Any politician that says, I'm not a climate scientist, so I'm not sure if it's real, you should know that they're not very smart. We're not asking them to be climate scientists. We're simply asking them to be smart enough to listen to them. And if they can't listen to them, you shouldn't vote for them. And that they're willing to take bold action on climate change. The second thing is to organize. If you have time, like Jasmine said, to be able to, if you're in Arizona, go volunteer with Poder Latinx. You can learn from this young woman and all the stuff that she's done, and other organizers. Start organizing in your community. There's a lot also that folks can do at the local level. There's stuff happening at cities, at counties. Organize, get involved with these groups. The other thing is to advocate. So advocate wherever you are for better climate solutions. So if you work at a workplace, ask them what they're doing to take advantages of the Inflation Reduction Act. When I go to my son's school, for example, I went to go have lunch with him, and I was prepared to go ask them to stop using plastic and see what their program was for, as a parent, about compostable or reusable materials. And they already had compostable materials, right? Like, so if you're a parent or if you work any place, like, you can ask what are their climate justice policies. And if they don't have one, say, oh, well, here's, you guys should have some, and have some recommendations. And the other one is educate. I think what I love about being a Latina is that we have like big, wonderful families for a lot of us, not all of us, but a lot of us do. And I really take seriously educating my family members on what we can do and how we're all part of the climate crisis and solving it, especially for, I think a lot of people, when they think of young Latinos, they only think of college kids. But the most common age, this is a panel of mostly Latinas, the most common age for a Latina to have her first child is age 25. And I'll tell you, as a mama, I love my baby so much. He has asthma, right? He cares, but I think about how he has asthma and what he's going to confront. But I also educate him about all of the solutions. So you want to talk to someone that will talk to you about solar panels and electric cars and bikes, you can come talk to my 7-year-old. He's probably more educated than Ted Cruz and Greg Abbott or Donald Trump on the climate crisis. Educate our babies, because these little guys are so willing to absorb the information, and they are going to start advocating at a very early age. And so educate your family, educate your children, educate your primos, your primas, whoever that is. We are all educators on this crisis.
For sure. I think this is now my third day at Climate Week. And one thing that I learned is that, we can't expect to like create climate jobs or like, solar panels or EVs, like, sure, like that's like one step, to solve this crisis. But I think what we need to think about is like, how do we do everything that we do? How do we make that better for the climate? Like whether that's how can we make education better for the climate, like appliances, transportation, your curriculum, educating. So it's like, it's not an aspect of how do I join the climate movement, is like, how can I, like inject climate into my everyday life? That's important. So with that, let's go move over to Jessica and talk to us a little bit about the youth and in Florida.
Yeah, well, definitely off the bat, as a fellow youth vote organization, don't take your vote for granted, especially down ballot races. I mean, your soil and water commissioner, your city council members really have an impact on the resilience of your communities in small and big ways. So vote from the top all the way down your ballot, and do so every single election. But then, another thing that Christina mentioned, I think young Latinos in particular are in a unique position to be incredible communicators and to bridge, communication gaps between generations, between communities. I mean, my abuela is the queen of underconsumption. I don't think she's ever thrown a plastic container away from the supermarket, maybe ever. And she might not have the words or the rhetoric to talk about, being a champion for climate action or sustainability, but she has the practices. So being able to communicate that to other people of like, oh, here's some things that we do. And, also being able to the point of education, giving her the words that she's looking for in conveying what she does and why. So talking to our huge networks, our families, informing them of some of these policies and giving, tangible rhetoric to their experiences. And then also taking those experiences and, bringing them to other communities. This is why it matters. This is how it's impacting my family. You might not have experienced this, but this is our perspective. So I think, especially some, daughters of immigrants, granddaughters of immigrants and so forth, I think we're uniquely positioned to kind of just educate and bridge these gaps through communication and really share stories. And I think that, Hispanic people and Latinos are definitely not a monolith, but I'm so proud of our ability to community build and organize. I mean, whether you have a small family or a big family, in my experience, a lot of, especially in Florida, we have some really tight knit Latino communities. And just making sure that those networks have access to information and have access into information in the ways that they understand it, in the languages that they understand, is so important. And I think young people really are in a position a lot of times to help do that and help facilitate those conversations. So definitely taking advantage of that and kind of using your power in that way for good. And then also just, on the day-to-day, do what you can, join an organization if you have some free time. But also it doesn't even have to be that organized. Take a few of your friends, walk around the block and pick up some trash. I mean, I think some of those really small actions can really add up. Cleaning a park, you never know like who that might invite to then kind of enjoy it more, and that might be unfortunately less trash flying around for the next storm. These small actions really can build up and make a long-term difference, and educating and communicating that is also just going to further magnify those impacts. And I think young people really are going to be at the forefront of this change.
Yeah. And yeah, totally agree that Latinos are not a monolith. However, if you open our refrigerator, you're probably going to find an old mayonnaise jar filled with some salsa roja that has been there forever. So, Anna, talk to us about how the youth can join. How the youth can join the movement.
No, for sure. Of course, engaging with your elected and local candidates is super critical. And I want to add one more step to Christina's amazing list. Run for local office, run for office, especially if you live in Texas. I really wish I could be scrolling my cell phone number right now, like call me, because like what we know in local offices and city councils, all the way to Congress, is when we elect more people who look like us, like we can break and build against white supremacy that is obviously intricately a part of the institutionalized racism that exists from our code, like our state code, to our city charters, to our school board. Like there are places that we can break those moments and really bring folks that look like us into the actual conversation and sit them at the table. Now, I want to make this very clear though, when you sit at these intersections of being youth, of being women, of being queer, of being, young in particular, like it's harder. And I don't want to sugarcoat it, but candidates who we can trust to take on these tough fights, just know that there are groups like ourselves and others who really want to be a part of that effort, and you're your team to beat back on the climate change deniers and the anti-science extremists who love to sit and roost in Texas. But unfortunately, we are at unfortunately, we are at the epicenter of that, but we are also fortunate to have several women candidates even running this cycle who could become that next round of people. And they're just sick and tired of our communities being put on the back burner. And just to give a little highlight, we're really excited. This is not something we've shared too much, but we are going to be trying out even something we call like deep scouting in the Gulf Coast region in particular, as we know it's most impacted with Down Ballot Climate Initiative and our union brothers and sisters at Gulf Coast AFL-CIO to try to find candidates on the city, on the commissioner, on the school board level, and even maybe MUDs and SUDs, municipal utility districts and special utility districts, like people who have huge impacts on what resilience can look like in not only, of course, like our communities and our schools, but also like in our infrastructure. So this is something that we're really excited about building out a program that helps us filter in candidates who are pro-climate into our infrastructure in Texas. And it's something that we hope grows outside of Gulf Coast and the greater Houston area. So everywhere from like Orange, Texas to Angleton, but like an area that is 6 or 7 states, right? But with this opportunity, like it's getting our hope, the non-traditional, the younger, the the people who want to see the change when it comes to climate happening. And we hope to replicate it across Texas, because we know that we need folks who are being the most impacted, who are cored at the work, who are cored in the lived experience, and that is often the youth of our generation. So if anyone's in Texas, give us a holler, give us a shout out. We're really, really hoping to find that next generation of leaders, and we desperately need more millennials, even geriatric millennials like myself, to potentially our first Gen Z candidate in the state house. There's a lot of work to do in Texas, and very much so in the environmental justice work that we hope is that intersection of bringing people into power and really being at that seat of the table to fight and push back on the worst, because we know that we also have the best in Texas. So I'm really excited for that.
Yeah, I think something that people don't realize is that 10, 20 years from now, it's going to be, people like Jasmine, people like Jessica, who are going to be in those positions of power and who are going to be driving, like this fight forward. And I think, it's good right now that we're talking about climate. It's good that, we have Climate Week here and people are, putting this at the forefront. But I think people need to make space for the youth voice as well, because that's probably going to be and is the most important voice in the room that we should not forget about. So transitioning now to some solutions and talking about the future. So this past August was the 2-year anniversary of the Inflation Reduction Act, the largest piece of climate legislation in history. And since its passing 2 years, 270,000 new jobs have been created and over $350 billion in investments have flowed across the country. It's estimated that the IRA will create 9 million good jobs over the next 10 years. Good jobs meaning benefits, union, a good job. So this means that an average of 1 million jobs will be created for the next 10 years, just from this piece of legislation alone. Maybe let's start with Jessica this time. How can Latinos build a pipeline to these job and training opportunities and be part of the clean energy transition?
Well, I think, going back to the point of educating our communities and just spreading the word is going to be huge. I mean, not related directly to the IRA, but I mean, for youth specifically, the American Climate Corps was another huge solution and win that we had been pushing for. Making sure that young Latinos know about that, know where to apply, know when the deadlines are, knowing, how to get their foot in the door into some of these clean jobs. But back to the IRA, the same thing, right? The IRA paved the way for so much, like you said, investment and specifically like grants for, solution-based organizations and just spreading, what those grants are for, how can you potentially, apply for them, or who's getting them, just educating on a lot of times just the logistical barriers that a lot of people, especially if there's something like a language barrier, just making sure that our communities have whatever information they need to be able to take full advantage of these opportunities so they can then take them, run with them, and better us all and better all of our communities. So I think that's going just to be so key is, really understanding our role as educators and information spreaders.
Awesome. Yeah, and I think something that people don't think about is that just like any transition, there's going to be winners and there's going to be losers. And what we can to make sure that we create new positions for the people who are not benefiting from this. However, one of the main winners from a clean energy transition will be the trade and construction industry. So these buildings need to be retrofitted. We need to install HVAC. We need to install heat pumps into our house. We need to build new buildings that are more climate friendly. We need to manufacture the EVs. And these are fields that Latinos are already working in. So it's just, within our fingertips to just be educated and make sure that we are going to where the future is taking us to. So I think that's something that we don't talk about enough, that, as long as the clean energy transition happens, Latinos could benefit from this change as well. So I wanted to ask Cristina, how we can make sure that we incorporate Latinos into this transition.
So I think one of the coolest things about the Inflation Reduction Act is it's legislation about the climate crisis, about economic justice, and racial inequality. And so it's a huge piece of legislation. And what it did is said, not only we're going to invest in creation of building in a different way in this country, which means construction jobs. Not only we're going to invest in clean cars, which means we're going to think about manufacturing, but it also really highlighted not just job creation, but job quality, right? Good paying union jobs. When you talk about construction in the Inflation Reduction Act, there are real opportunities to invest and increase union density. I can tell you from having worked here in Texas, where it's 1% union density in the building trades. Construction jobs may be good jobs in other places, but when you don't have unions, employers want to, oftentimes big business, they're going to dilute those working conditions. So Texas here has some of the worst working conditions in the entire country. Every place where unions don't have high density, you have high deaths, high injuries, low wages, wage theft. Unions mean healthcare, good paying jobs, time with your family off, and also addressing racial inequities that often exist in key industries. That is how we win. So the Inflation Reduction Act has things like suggestions on local hiring. So if you're in a community, making sure that they're hiring and training from those communities if they're building. It also benefits union manufacturing. So that's what you saw with cars and the United Auto Workers, who just has had major wins. And they're supporting, guess what? They're supporting the clean energy transition because they know it also means good jobs for their union members. And so there's this legislation, I don't think people fully understand yet because it's still just rolling out, the benefits that have been created around good paying jobs. And as Latinos, we are huge, huge benefactors of what this means. And for me, having worked with so many people in our community that do some of the most dangerous, deadly jobs that we all benefit from, right? If you eat food in this country, you can thank a Latino worker because they probably helped pick or grow that food or bring that meat or eggs to you. If you live in a house or go into a building, I promise you there's some Latino hands that worked on that probably. And those jobs right now, they don't have to be dangerous jobs. They can be good jobs. And is what this legislation does. It not only says we're creating jobs, but we are going to demand and create good jobs for American workers, all American workers, and that means Latinos in the process.
Yeah, I mean, the IRA is just so huge that it's just like, sometimes difficult to comprehend. But one thing that we worked on in the past is on the Greenhouse Gas Reduction Fund that actually funds a lot of new green banks in the country, which will actually be good for young entrepreneurs who want to start, like a new business, who want to go into something different and kind of build something from scratch. I mean, it's crazy to think about like, oh, wow, like I can be part of the climate movement while being an entrepreneur as well. So there's just so many things to really benefit from the legislation that we haven't even thought about yet. So Jasmine, I know that you kind of do work on the ground on the Inflation Reduction Act and really educate people on its benefits. Tell me how you are doing that on the ground in Arizona.
Yeah, I think that's a great question. I think part of the work that I do is meeting people where they are at. So that has been a key factor in making sure I am properly informing my community. I take it with great honor and great pride to be a trusted source of information to my community members. And this past year has been heavily focused on the Inflation Reduction Act. So I am truly meeting my community where they already are. So whether that is the Consulado Mexicano, the Mexican consulate, at community events, at schools, at local health centers, we understand that our community is busy, our community works hard, and often they may not have that time to set aside and specifically learn about a specific piece of legislation. So I am there, I come prepped with my one-pagers, and I really, really want to get the point across that these legislations have a direct impact in our community, and we truly have to take advantage and educate ourselves about legislation and policy that takes place. I think it's important to highlight specifically when we're talking about clean jobs that Latinos belong in these spaces. Latinos belong in the conversation of the Inflation Reduction Act. We belong in these positions of employment that are as a result of the IRA. I think oftentimes we only have a specific vision about certain careers. I know that I was a first-gen college student, and I had a very narrow vision of what jobs were even available simply because I didn't know many people who had careers. And I think it's important as, Latinos in this space to make sure that we are out talking to our younger counterparts or individuals who are interested in this career field or individuals who are interested in switching careers, to make sure that they understand that there is space for these individuals to be there, and there is space for them to hold employment that have livable wages and, as you said, are good paying jobs. And a lot of our skills are transferable. That is another main thing that I want to get across. Sometimes the space, doesn't have many of us. I know that oftentimes I'm the only Latina at certain roundtables or at certain events, and it can be discouraging. And oftentimes maybe we think that we don't have the proper skills to enter in these workforces, but I want to point that across that we do. And that's why it's so important to have these conversations and really let our community know what is out there, specifically the Inflation Reduction Act, but of course, all of those clean energy jobs that have come as a result.
Awesome, thank you. And I know Natalie is also doing some community awareness and education work around the IRA, and also I think building a pipeline to some funding as well. So maybe you can talk to us a little bit about the jobs and opportunities around that piece of legislation.
Yeah, absolutely. I'd be happy to. And I think one of the things I'd like to highlight for today is the opportunities that have been created through the IRA related to like job training and like how people actually become aware of this sector, because we know that Latinos are currently underrepresented in the clean energy workforce compared to other sectors, but there's an opportunity now for that gap to be closed. And so there are federal agencies like the DOE, the Department of Energy, the Environmental Protection Agency that have made very clear commitments to supporting Latino engagement in the clean energy workforce. And so there's more internships, there's fellowships, there's competitions, training programs, all of these things that are designed to specifically support underrepresented communities, including Latinos. And so these programs for the first time are providing a clear pathway into the clean energy sector and making sure that we aren't being left behind as it continues to grow. I think there's also something really important to consider when we're doing community outreach and like how we're socializing the clean energy transition. And that's that there's a huge economic benefit for our community members. So transitioning into clean energy jobs often means earning higher wages. Most green jobs, as we know, pay a higher median wage than traditional Latino occupations, and this wage advantage holds true even for those outside of fields that have been historically employed by our Latino workers. So this could be a huge game changer for a lot of people, especially those in our lower wage positions that are looking for more sustainable and better paying career options. And yeah, I think, there's a lot of support networks, both within our federal agencies, but also at the local and state government levels. So there's, just transition offices, there's sustainability departments that you can reach out to. I also always like to call up electric cooperatives for our Latino populations that live in more rural areas. There's a lot of organizations out there that are now able to offer the support needed to make transition happen for the first time for our communities.
Yeah, in any major transition like this, there's always going to be a ton of opportunities available to everyone. And, we want to make sure that Latinos kind of may get access to these opportunities. So, Ana, wanted to ask you, what, how can Texas Latinos access these opportunities and kind of be ready for that transition?
I think it's participating in conversations just like this. There's a lot of false idols, false flags, as many of y'all on this panel know. When it comes to clean energy in Texas, we talk about big oil, we talk about big oil and gas. But the reality is, even in 2021, there was already 238,000 plus workers already employed by clean energy jobs in Texas. It spoke to, even before the IRA, the need and the depth that was already taking place. And then even with this potential investment, I think it was estimated over like $66 billion in Texas alone between 2022 to 2030. And that is going to mean new, like as Ms. Bin mentioned, good paying jobs, clean jobs, and upward mobility, something that the far right has tried and has, I think, somewhat succeeded in kind of taking from some of like the more progressive movement spaces of like, what does it mean to participate in the economy? And it can mean clean jobs and clean air. And on top of that, like manufacturing is a boon in Texas, right? And manufacturing employs like over 870,000 workers in Texas alone. And with things like the IRA, we're looking at ways to like bring, what does it mean to strengthen the supply chain? What does it mean to invest in technology? What does it mean to like be a part of the boon of clean energy and transportation technologies in Texas, which has been a lot of our bread and butter for so long. So I think it's educating. I'm so thankful to be on the panel with a lot of folks who are doing this deep work, especially in places like Texas where they exist and they have access. And as someone who watched my grandfather work as a master mechanic, and my father built crates as he was putting himself through school, like it was those moments where access and opportunity equaled where I am today, like in a position of extreme privilege. So this is generational, and we're so excited to see what the investment means. But in all, like it also means clean air, clean jobs, clean water. And I just really hoping like this is generational. So I know we're not seeing it all at once, but from what Texas needs and where we're growing, especially with I believe one of the, if not the youngest population in the country, like this is going to mean an entire generation of wealth and opportunity in the state of Texas.
Yeah. And I think something that we need to remember as well is like, I think when people talk about the economy and like wage stagnation and not being able to get good jobs, I mean, they like to say like, oh, well, that's the free market, or that's this, or that's that. But I mean, 40 years ago, like unions were extremely powerful in this country. People were getting good paying jobs. People had, something to kind of fall back on when they retired. And, that can be duplicated as easily now. We just need to make sure that we're all kind of working towards the same thing and making sure that Latinos are being included in this transition. So we have our last question here before we transition to some audience questions. And I just want to leave this last question open, and whoever wants to answer it, and then we'll move on to some audience questions. So when it comes to the IRA, most people have not heard about what it is and how it has benefited the American people. Anyone who wants to answer it, can you please discuss how the IRA has benefited your communities today, and what are the future benefits of this legislation?
I'll just jump in really quick. So I knew someone that got in a car accident, car got totaled, needed a new car really quick, something that was affordable, able to get kid and her to the school, single mom, and was able to get a Chevy Bolt, a union-made car. And that person is me. And I got a Chevy made. I got a union-made electric car, 100% electric car. I was kind of nervous buying it at first because I was like, I'm not sure about the range or how it's going to be to get that car. I now have at my house my electric charger, and through the IRA, so I got $7,500 back to buy that car. Ended up being like $20,000 nearly for an electric new car. And my son loves it. Everyone that rides it says it's like being in Super Mario's Brothers in your Yoshi, because it's so fun to drive. It's so zippy. And the other thing I got is I got solar panels on my little 1,200 square foot house. And I got, with the city rebate and the federal rebate, the cost nearly in half. And I got a loan out for the rest, and I'm paying less than I was paying before. So the thing that people don't talk about the IRA and for Latinos is how much we can save as families if we take advantage of the IRA. Now, my electricity is 100% clean solar energy, covers my house, my charging my car, and I pay less than I did before. I never have to go to a gas station. I don't change the oil. It's amazing. And these are all kinds of benefits that Americans everywhere can benefit from. And you can also use them to buy used cars. I don't know if people know that. So there are so many great opportunities. It's totally transformed my life. And I feel like I'm part of the climate solution as well. And I tell everybody about it. And I want everybody to know, because it was really accessible and easy. I thought it was going to be hard or confusing, but it was really accessible and easy.
Awesome. Does anybody else want to take a stab at the question before we transition to more questions from the audience?
Yes, please. Very quickly, I just want to highlight the rebates in Arizona, the HERE rebates to home electrification and appliances that soft launched last month thanks to the Office of Resiliency and, of course, thanks to the Inflation Reduction Act. These rebates are going to be monumental for our community. They offer point-of-sale discounts for electrification projects, but the first phase that was soft launch actually goes in and helps individuals from low-income and disadvantaged communities to repair their ACs. This is often life or death situations for a lot of our community members. So I really wanted to highlight that the Inflation Reduction Act and the rebates and all of these initiatives as a result are currently and will save families in Arizona and across the entire country. I encourage everyone to really keep up to date. I know that every state has different programs, but I did want to highlight and commend the Inflation Reduction Act and the Office of Resiliency here for these rebates. Again, it's the Home Electrification Appliance Program, which is doing great. And I'm so excited to continue working with my local coalition of Latino business owners that work in AC. And I'm truly excited for this. So I just wanted to highlight that program really quickly.
Awesome. Thank you. So now we'll go ahead and take some questions from our Instagram. I think we will see it popping up on the screen. Yeah, so any thoughts on the connection between the meat, dairy, and animal agricultural industries and the negative health and environmental effects they have on our communities? Open question for the forum.
So I'm happy as a 26-year vegan to take that one. So one, I would say first, I don't advocate for everyone to have to be plant-based. I understand everybody's got to make their own choices, but I do think that there's real connections to environmental impacts in how we eat and agriculture. One of the things we have to look at is how we grow our food, how we distribute our food, if we're going to tackle the climate crisis, and can also make our lives and health better, especially as Latinos. You know, we have very high rates of diabetes, and also really struggle living in food deserts. So when we talk about expanding access to good food, healthy food, we also have to talk about that. And it's also a workers' rights issue, because we know that in many of these factory farms, workers often, these are sometimes unionized jobs, a lot of times they're not. And so people, high rates of injury, high rates of illness and sickness. There's even been cases in some of these slaughterhouses of children working that are Latinos. And so there's a whole host of justice issues around food. But I will say one of the things that's exciting to me is as we look at more plant-based diets, right? It doesn't have to only be plant-based, but more plant-based diets. I just did a calculation. So I've been plant-based for 26 years. And I have literally, so an average meat eater in the United States uses so much more water than I do. So I've used about 2.5 million gallons of water to produce my food over the last 26 years. The average American diet has used roughly 38 million gallons in that same time period of water to produce their food. So I've saved the planet 36 million gallons of water by having a plant-based diet, which I'm really proud of, not to mention like the less carbon reduction in the air. And I feel healthy. People always ask me like, about my diet. And so I share it. You don't all have to be plant-based, but it's a really fun way to like expand your palate and also make all of our Latino dishes vegan. And I like to remind people that pork and beef and chicken were all European introductions to the Mexican diet. And those foods did not exist in the Americas before Spaniards brought them over. So I love eating beans, corn, the three sisters, beans, corns, and squash that are all native to the Americas. And you can DM me on Instagram if you want to learn more about great ways to make Latino diet plant-based.
Yeah, I'll just I've only been vegetarian/vegan for a decade, so working to follow in your footsteps, Christina.
You're gonna beat me. I'm older than you, so you're gonna be fine.
I love this question. I think this is so important, and I think once we understand that, I think it's about 80% of agricultural workers are Hispanic. The workplace and safety conversation is just so important too, especially within animal agriculture, the way that often the lives of animals are taken. There's been some really interesting studies on the psychological effects of that on workers, and again, just the physical safety of it too. So making sure that, again, these problems that are just disproportionately impacting our communities. We have to talk about them. We have to explore the solutions of them and prevent, lives from being taken and, these mental health impacts from continuing. Also, just wanted to echo another thing Christina said, making sure that, we're having these conversations in ways that are also culturally appropriate. I mentioned my dad in construction earlier, spends a lot of time outside. He has had 2 heart attacks, big meat eater. So something personally I've been trying to push is, just a few more vegetables in his day-to-day meals. But just making those, for me, Bolivian dishes in a vegan version or some sides, making them, something that he doesn't have to give up his barbecue parties, making them, attainable and enjoyable still is also a big part of the conversation, I think. And again, just always taking an intersectional lens to it. How does this also affect and rely on access to, grocery stores, and I think very importantly, mental health care and healthcare in general. Thankfully my dad was able to have insurance through my mom's job, not his construction job, but, making sure that we just have the resources we need to prevent these problems and solutions for when they inevitably arise.
Awesome. Yeah, as someone who has tried some vegan pozole, there's definitely options to make things better for the climate. So that actually wraps up our discussion for today. I hope you guys are extremely educated, are extremely excited, and just kind of learned a lot from this discussion. I know I did. So thank you for joining us. We really appreciate your time. And before we end, we just wanted to pass it back to Christina for a quick conclusion. And thank you guys for joining us.
Yeah, thank you so much, Adrian, and thank you so much to our panelists who are all busy doing so much incredible work in their home states and across the country. And it's exciting to have this conversation during Climate Week. I just wanted to leave folks on a really a note of positivity. I think sometimes it can be hard in the face of all that we're up against with the climate crisis, but I think with the climate crisis, it also allows us to reimagine and tackle big inequalities and problems that have long existed in our society. And I want to talk about one place that I think about that's kind of an example of that in Houston, Texas. So you all may know that Houston, as I mentioned earlier, is really home to the oil and gas industry, but it could be home to the clean energy future of the country. And that would actually transform and make people's lives better in Houston. So in Houston, I want to talk about one community. It's in Sunnyside. So this is a low-income community, mostly African-American and some Latino. And they are building right now, transforming what was a trash dump that was not only a stain, but an environmental hazard for this local community, low-income folks. And it's now being worked on to create the largest urban solar farm through the IRA and local investments in the entire country. So transforming a hazardous trash dump into the largest urban solar farm that's also going to have parks. And they're cleaning up, the hazard materials that have long been there polluting the community to build this farm. It's 240 acres. It's going to produce electricity for 5,000 up to 10,000 homes. It's going to remove 120 million tons of carbon from the air. And it also has, we talked about good quality job creation, 10% of the trainees that are going to work on the project are going to come from local communities. So those jobs, at least a minimum of 10% are guaranteed for the people that live in that community. And they get to have pride in their work, that they're cleaning up their community. They're providing clean energy to their community at an affordable rate. And they're going to have good jobs. So imagine when we do that on scale across the country and how that transforms our lives to save money, clean up our communities, make our communities healthier for our children and every single future generation. That, to me, is what inspires me, not just what we're up against, but but all that we can transform to make our country and our communities better.